How do we know that the book of Isaiah was not written by one person, but was actually written by multiple authors? So I want to discuss with you the significant issue in modern biblical scholarship, the question of how and when the book of Isaiah was composed. While traditional religious views often attribute the entire 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah to the son of Amoz, which is a 8th century BCE character, critical scholarship has since, in the 18th to 19th centuries, argued that the text is a composite written by at least three different authors, distinct authors, over a long historical span of time. From the Assyrian era to the Babylonian exile and into the post-exilic era, which would be during the time frame of the Persians and maybe the early Greek period. So, how is this broken down? So the scholarly model is basically broken down into Proto, Deutero, and Trito Isaiah. I like to call them, and actually one of the scholars, Hume, called them First Isaiah, Second Isaiah, and Third Isaiah. So I will most likely refer to them in First, Second, and Third. The first Isaiah, or the Proto Isaiah, is chapters 1 through 39, and most scholars associate this core with the historical prophet Isaiah, the actual person, the son of Amoz, roughly in the latter half of the 8th century BCE during the Assyrian threat. The second part of Isaiah, which is the Deutero Isaiah, this is chapters 40 through 55. This section is often thought to have been composed during the Babylonian exile, which is the 6th century BCE. And then we have the third Isaiah, which is the Trito Isaiah. This goes from chapters 56 to chapter 66. Many attribute these to the post-exilic time frame, which would be after 538 BCE, when they were freed by Darius. And the author, and so it's either an author or the schools of thought that was going on, and this can go into the Greek era. This, what they call the tripartite division, is widely accepted amongst most critical scholars. Of course, your apologists are going to think differently. But let's go through each time frame, and the reasons why why the scholarly rationale is as such. So the first Assyrian period, or the first Isaiah period, certain oracles in chapters 36 through 39 reflect the historical Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib, which happened in 701 BCE, and even mentions the death of Sennacherib and these events are consistent with Isaiah, the son of Amos' lifetime. The second Isaiah, which is during the Babylonian exile time frame, the tone of the information, the tone of the book shifts from 40 through 55. From judgment to consolidation. Consolation, sorry, not consolidation, consolation. From imminent siege and return. The author speaks through although the exile has occurred, and is looking to comfort the people. And he even says so in Isaiah 40 that he is the comfort of the people, of my people, and even names Cyrus. They even name Cyrus as the Persian king, which historically places this material in around the 6th century BCE, since it's denoting who the Cyrus is. Now, I know people are going to say that's what makes it a prophecy, because they predicted Cyrus. But based on the tone and the linguistics, we're going to see something totally different when it comes to that. And then you have the post-exilic, which is the third Isaiah in chapter 56 through 66. And this contains language and concerns that many scholars think is relevant to a community that's back in Judah. Right? They're back in what we call Israel in this aspect, back in Jerusalem. So they're rebuilding, and they're reestablishing their social and their religious structures. So the tone change, and Bernhard Durham is a key figure in developing this hypothesis. And he first articulated this idea of a first, second, and third Isaiah. So when we continue to look at this information, what we see is there's a linguistic style differences, there's historical references, there's redaction and compilations that are just different. And there's so many other things. So why do scholars think this way? Why have some maintain this line of argument? The vocabulary and the literary style and the theological tone shifts between the three parts. For example, the servant song, which is in Isaiah 49, 42, 52 through 53, are often tied to uh, particularly to the Deutero Isaiah by the critics of Durham, because their style different in the earlier oracles. The changes in imagery, the thematic emphasis, the judgment, it goes from judgment to comfort to restoration, because it goes through this process that demonstrates uh, going from the Assyrians to the Babylonians to being back in Jerusalem, under the Persians. So it goes through this process that lasts for a couple hundred years. And the way that this God's relationship is towards Israel, it is expressed a different historical context and purpose for how God, the God of the Bible, is relating to Israel, which is relative to the different time frames that the Bible is being written. And then with some of its historical references, the fact that it names Cyrus. This is one of those sticking points because this is where many Christians say, well, that was prophecy and he was a prophet, right? But the problem with that is that we also can tell that this is one of the most striking arguments that Isaiah 44:28 and 45:1, because it's explicitly mentioning Cyrus and that he's the Persian king who conquers Babylon in 539 BCE, that many argue that it's historically impossible that an 8th century BCE prophet would have known the name Cyrus, right? This is an indication that the author is writing at a much, much later time frame, right? In the second section, from 40 through 55, there's a reference to the Babylonian exile as if had already happened. So, and when because it says you have already served your term, which suggests that the author was speaking to or from a displaced community, right? So it's already putting them in a space where they, as if a people had already been through this exile, like they have been released. This is why it's not that some of it's written during these exilic contents, exilic time frames they've been finished with their exile. And then there's a lot, the redaction of the compilation. The scholarly consensus is that the book was compiled over time, that you had oracles, and sermons, and prophecies, and these were most likely circulating uh, under the name Isaiah. And according to Britannica, the canonical Isaiah likely assumed its final form in the 4th century BCE, suggesting an editorial process spanning centuries. So what according to Britannica, it has been a compilation, and some of these scribes argue that there was a school of Isaiah, that they preserved the earlier edition, and then edited and adopted the material to fit into each time frame, meaning that you have the original writings of Isaiah, then you have a school of Isaiah followers. As they go from Assyrian to Babylonian to Persian, they adapt the first writing of Isaiah to fit what they are going through at that time frame. It's kind of like writing a Cinderella story back in the 1800s, and you adapt it to the modern day culture as you go through time. Just a school of Isaiah. Now, when we get into some of the statistical analysis, people tend to go one way or another when it comes to that. But some studies have shown that the frequency of a literary style has been used to argue both for and against the unity. There are people who have conducted, like Adams, who have conducted a scientific analysis and concluded that there is more internal stylistic consistency than divisionists claim, though he still did not rule out the fact that it could still have different authors. This is why the idea of the school of Isaiah is still one of the prominent thought process, but this still would indicate that there's not one Isaiah who wrote the entire thing. And then we have, I did find a study information that said that more recently, They have digital humanities have used AI uh, to what did it say? They have used digital humanities have approached even AI using AI have been employed. For example, researchers use pattern recognition techniques on the Great Isaiah Scroll, which comes from the Dead Sea Scroll, which is a 200 BCE document. I mean, 200 BCE or 200 CE document, and have found evidence that shifts the scribal hands. And now, the concern of the manuscript transmission is manuscript transmission rather than the original composite, though. So this is just how the information would have been copied, not so much what the original information, the original documentation had. It's just how well it was copied. So it hasn't really delivered much on the debate of whether or not Isaiah was written by one person or written by multiple people. In the theological and prophetic interpretations, which is where we get hung up a lot, where a lot of apologists get hung up. If multiple authors wrote Isaiah across centuries of time, this would complicate the claims of his predictive philosophy. I mean, predictive prophecy. In a simple way, the passage that names Cyrus, for it, or describes or describe the exiles might be describing Cyrus and the exiles. This would be a after the fact, right? That they are not writing about something that was foreseen in the 8th century BCE, but it is something that they are writing after the fact, after Cyrus has come, after they have been released and sent back and allowed to go back to Jerusalem. So they're writing after the fact. Now, for believers, this interpretation, this raises interpretation challenges. Um, the book still has to be prophetic to them. So they have to say that, 8th century Isaiah wrote the entire thing and prophesied about Cyrus, and that it wasn't something that an after the fact community wrote, right? If they don't renegotiate this in their minds in order for it to fit, then they will have to admit that the book is not a prophetic book, but Isaiah must be prophetic. So they will have to say that with confirmation bias, that Isaiah was written by one person and that he predicted Cyrus, and it wasn't written in the post-exilic, even though linguistically it is more probable that it did. Scholastically, it is more probable that it did. Now, not all scholars agree. This is just the scholastic consensus, but there are some scholars who don't agree that it was written by multiple authors. And this is usually the conservatives. This is usually those who are apologists. They are going to take the entire thing that's been written by one person, and that Cyrus was genuinely prophesied by Isaiah, and because they have to believe it, it has to fit. Uh, the critics of the divisionist model sometimes worry about undermining the supernatural and the predictive dimensions of the prophecy. They want to defend and argue and that and recognizing the redaction does not diminish the theological depth. Defenders of it argue that it doesn't take away the theological depth. Meaning that you can still utilize it as a theological book, just not as a book of prophecy. You can still talk about the messages, just you don't have to say that it's a prophecy. It doesn't diminish that, except for the fact that if a prophet, because you're taking away the idea that it was a prophecy, you can just say that the school of Isaiah was a continuation. But they hold so tight onto the doctrine that Isaiah was a prophet, that this was a prophecy, that they're too afraid to just say, oh, it's just come from a school of thought. And that theological school of thought is just saying that this same message is valid through this whole time frame as they were followers of Isaiah. But it's hard for people to give up their doctrine. Once your doctrine is in place, once you've said it, believed it, it is hard for people to stop and move forward with new lines of thinking. But I digress. uh, Let me give you a few examples of why scholars think that it was written by different people in different time frames. So Isaiah 39 through 36 through 39, which is first Isaiah, like these chapters describe the Assyrian invasions, right? They talk about the siege of Jerusalem under King Hezekiah, the death of Sennacherib, um, and these are typically things that are happening in the eighth. These are things that happen in the 8th century BCE, and these are tied to the actual prophet. This is when an actual prophet Isaiah, if he existed, would have been walking and talking. But historically, it is impossible for him to, in Isaiah 44, 28 through 45 through 45 and 1, that he would mention Cyrus and by name specifically, and the context of after he came into power, which occurs in the late 6th century BC under the Persian rule. He would not be able to write that if it was actually him writing it. This is why they hold it as a prophecy. But then the tone continues to shift, and there's some religious shifts because from Isaiah 56 1 through 8, it calls for this is third Isaiah. It calls for justice, Sabbath observation, inclusion of foreigners, which is a different tone shift, and a community of rebuilding, resonating with the restored post-exilic community in Jerusalem, because that's what we see archaeologically, what was happening in this restored community once the Persians had released them back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, that they had their religiosity was a bit different than it was in 8th century. So their thought process on foreigners was different than 8th century. So we see a difference. These things can be only explained by not a prophecy, but being explained by different authors writing at different time frames in order to come up with these different aspects of it. So the major problem here that believers have is who wrote Isaiah and when. This has been a major topic of biblical criticism all the way up into right now. If you've never read Bernard Durham information, and it's Duhm, he's a late 19th, early 20th century author, scholar, I should say. He pioneered the historical and critical methods to Isaiah. Like the way we view these things today stem from him. And he identified the servant song and argued that it belonged to the Deutero Isaiah. And he articulated that the first Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah divisions are most likely. And over time, his hypothesis has been refined by other scholars. And even up until today, is still being refined. And oftentimes, the conclusion is still coming back to the fact that the Isaiah is not a monolithic work. It is not written by one author, but it was an original, possibly more than like an original Isaiah who was in Jerusalem during the time frame of the Assyrian conquest, who laid a siege upon Jerusalem, who ransacked the rest of northern Israel, and then uh, he was a son of Amoz. The school of Isaiah may have been created at that time frame, and that school of Isaiah allowed for during the Babylonian exile, which happened in the 6th century BCE, 200 years later, to be able to continue with this mindset and seeing how the Babylonian exile was similar to the Assyrian exile, meaning that the Assyrians came in and they took tribute, and they took not out of Jerusalem because they left Jerusalem alone after Hezekiah paid them off, but they took the best and brightest out of Jerusalem, out of Lachish and all these other cities. And then the Babylonians came in and they sacked the Assyrians, and in doing so, they sacked Jerusalem, and they took the best and bright out of Jerusalem and brought them into Babylonian captivity. And then when the Persians came, so that shows that's a similar thing to what happened with the Assyrians being under conquest. Then everything shifts when the Persians come. There is no exile, but it is a return, and the tone changes. The religiosity changes. Their treatment towards other people changes as they have now are moving into this time frame of being under Persian rule, learning of Zoroastrian ways of a all good God, all evil deity, and having a difference in their thought process as they move into the Greek period as well. And some of the The latter parts of Isaiah are thought to have been written during the Greek era, but what we do know that the final edits occurred during the Greek era. So that this has been a more detailed version of when I say Isaiah is not written by the same person. Isaiah was written by at least three different people, if not three different groups of people, which does not make it, which makes it, I'm writing after an event happened. And that doesn't make it prophecy. That's just making you accounting for what you believe to be history. And some of it is historical. Who conquered them, where they conquered them, historical stuff. But the rest, not so much. But these are the things that we do when we deconstruct. We break down how there's a doctrine that you have been taught, but then there's the truth of what something is. And the fact of the matter is, most people are going to believe that Isaiah was a prophet and he wrote this whole thing in the 8th century BCE and that he predicted all of these things. But yet, the scholarly consensus is that he did not, that this follows a school of thought that is being written after the fact. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.